Phạm Xuân Ẩn, a U.S.-trained Vietnamese national, spent many years working as a correspondent for U.S. media in Vietnam. No one noticed that this meek-looking man is actually a dangerous spy. The French forces were defeated by the Vietnamese forces of the Viet Minh, led by the renowned General Vo Nguyen Giap, in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. It was the pivotal fight in the Indochina War, and the French military presence there. The Geneva Accords, which were signed in July 1954, came after that setback. France acknowledged the separation of Vietnam into two nations, a communist North Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh and a South Vietnam supported by the United States, and recognized the independence of the countries of Indochina in those agreements. As a result, there is almost universal agreement among historians of the area that the Vietnam War was a continuation of the Indochina War. Instead, the Second Indochina Conflict and the 10,000-day conflict are the terms used by the Vietnamese. For the benefit of governments or organizations, they gather and analyze sensitive information. They carry out covert operations, infiltration, and other forms of surveillance to obtain information about prospective threats or to their advantage. Because of the often secretive nature of their employment, it calls for extreme discretion and professionalism. They could work covertly or assume different identities. They need a high level of skill, training, and mental toughness for their work, which can be dangerous. Their practice frequently involves emotional deceit and manipulation. On the same Vietnamese terrain, years after the Geneva Accords in 1955, the conflict between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Vietnam North, Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam broke out and lasted until 1975. The Soviet Union and China-led Eastern Camp provided material support for the Northerners, while the United States of America and several of its regional allies provided help for the Southerners. The United States of America has not made an official statement regarding this war. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the precise date of its founding became a point of contention. Prior to 1998, when American military advisors who died in Vietnam after November 1, 1955 were regarded as having died in the Vietnam War, it was widely believed that the conflict was the responsibility of President John F. Kennedy's administration, which sent 15,000 military advisors to South Vietnam starting in 1961. In the American psyche, the Vietnam War has left behind severe scars and wounds that are challenging to mend. The forces of darkness are at work in this struggle, as they are in all the wars and conflicts that the world has seen and continues to see. The Vietnam War gained similar media attention to the Indochina War, and experts in this conflict began to make claims about knowing the enigmas and secrets of Vietnam and realizing the causes of all the changes the war brought about. Direct American military engagement in the Vietnam War started in 1965 after two American destroyers came under fire from North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. A Vietnamese journalist named Phạm Xuân Ẩn was employed by Time magazine in that year. Due to his 1956 schooling in the USA and his Californian apprenticeship at the Sacramento Bee, he was well known among Americans. He went back to Saigon a year later and began reporting for Associated Press and then Reuters. Phạm Xuân Ẩn, who was present for the fall of Saigon and may have even played a part in it without Americans realizing it, was the only Vietnamese person employed full-time by an American media outlet up until 1975. On September 12, 1927, Phạm Xuân Ẩn was born in the southern Vietnamese village of Bien Ha. Young Phạm Xuân Ẩn, just 16, finds himself fighting in the war against French colonialism and Japanese occupation in 1944. He was given a job carrying mail by the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese Resistance Army, and he started his career working in the shadows. People who were close friends with Phạm Xuân Ẩn recall him as a cheerful, collected, and helpful man. As the proprietor of a joke and someone who lived in perfect peace with the Vietnamese, Americans, and everyone around him, he was welcomed with open arms at all places, including the American embassy in Saigon. He served as a resource on Vietnamese affairs, but the CIA agents frequently visited him for guidance on specific issues, and he was generous with it. He was able to get information that would allow him to see the direction of circumstances, militarily and politically, about which there were no uncertainties thanks to the relationships he built with senior American military figures and those in charge of other crucial sectors. The Americans thought of him as a trustworthy friend and even perceived him as one of them in thought. Perhaps the serenity that defined him dispelled many people's doubts. According to Phạm Xuân Ẩn, after he returned to Vietnam from the United States of America in 1957, old Viet Minh comrades called him and requested all the information he had on the American military operations in Vietnam. He claimed that he accepted acting as a double agent out of a sense of patriotism since he saw no justification for the American involvement in Vietnam. It was evident to him that what was needed was to spy on the Americans. His life was hidden behind a facade. Up until Saigon's fall, Phạm Xuân Ẩn was able to keep his secret. According to journalistic works, Phạm Xuân Ẩn was able to survive by arming himself with several safety measures. He was in charge of selecting the messengers who delivered his messages and those of the northern officials, and he did not think twice to reject the nomination of anyone he deemed unfit for the job. He was in complete control of his covert existence. He commanded a network of 45 couriers and spies, 27 of whom were killed or imprisoned. Phạm Xuân Ẩn was calmly monitoring everything that was happening around him. Years later, he demonstrated to his interlocutors the behavior he followed and adhered to when reading his communications. He would hide in the toilet and shut the door tightly so that, in the case of a surprise, he would have time to get rid of anything that would expose him. Phạm Xuân Ẩn never left his dogs behind. He chose them from the German Shepherd dog breed and trained them to make a slight noise when they noticed a strange movement. He did his best to avoid having to meet one of his designated spies, but when he did, he took care to make sure that none of them was a monitoring station. His wife was distantly following him. Her job is to alert the Vietnamese resistance if he is captured whenever he attends such sessions. No one else in his family circle, outside his wife and mother, was aware of his espionage operation. Despite owning a gun, Phạm Xuân Ẩn chose not to carry it because he was worried about misusing it, because he lacked formal military training. This other side of Phạm Xuân Ẩn, the one whose placid features conceal even during the most traumatic and explosive situations, was never disclosed by the Americans or their South Vietnamese allies. He was always grinning as he listened to individuals who were speaking to him, prepared to respond in a way that would be sufficiently convincing. Despite his numerous concerns, he did not hesitate to visit the coffee shop where he would run across other journalists as well as friends among the intelligentsia, politicians, and military men. He may be keen to uphold some traditions because of a desire to come out as someone who has a routine existence. And it was at those councils that he demonstrated his aptitude for analyzing the recurring events on the Vietnamese scene. His co-workers as well as the diplomats or military officials with whom he conversed much valued those analyses. It is reported that General Vo Nguyen Giap, who beat the French forces at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, would frequently repeat as he read the reports that Phạm Xuân Ẩn was sending, "We are now in the area of American military activities." The American Special War Secret Program was one of those reports, and it was revealed key details of the American military strategy in Vietnam through its 5 versions between 1961 and 1963, along with all the amendments made to that program. This allowed the leadership of the Vietnamese resistance to conduct preventative operations. The United States of America's plan has had disastrous repercussions. Although Operation Rolling Thunder, which directly targeted North Vietnam as part of that strategy, was one of the bloodiest, it had no effect on the ongoing supply of supplies meant for communist fighters in southern Vietnam. The United States had just finished 8 years of intensive combat operations in Vietnam in 1973. There was no other option but to stop the conflict and then sign the Paris Agreement due to the significant material and human costs. However, fighting between South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese soldiers persisted up until 1975. Moreover, it didn't just come to an end with Saigon, the country's capital, falling. Ho Chi Minh will now be the city's name. Phạm Xuân Ẩn made careful to evacuate his family from Saigon before the city fell, and after the Southerners lost their war, he traveled to Hanoi and was promoted to colonel in the army. His biggest shock came when the communists who had won the war decided to send him to a rehabilitation camp, after which he was put under house arrest and forbidden from having any contact with the outside world. He soon noticed that the northern leaders were expressing some kind of concern about the relationships that he had with the Americans. He received a retirement grant with the rank of general at the conclusion of his life, which was not more than $30. The American intelligence officers in particular were suffering as a result of their error in judgment in allowing this spy to infiltrate them after learning his true identity. Phạm Xuân Ẩn, 79, passed away from pneumonia in 2006.